At issue this Sunday, will he stay in the race? From elected Democrats to donors and delegates, President Biden is facing calls to step aside. The first Massachusetts official who calls for a different candidate, Senator Jason Lewis, is here. Plus, above the law, the Supreme Court rules former presidents have absolute immunity from prosecution for official acts on the job. What does it mean for former President Trump's criminal cases? NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas is here to break it all down. And chaos at the Cannabis Control Commission. We'll speak with Inspector Jeffrey Shapiro about his calls to appoint someone to oversee the troubled agency. At Issue starts now. Good Sunday morning and welcome to another edition of At Issue. I'm Corey Smith, back after 4 months of paternity leave. Sue welcomed me back by taking the weekend off. Coming up, we'll talk President Biden's age, Donald Trump's immunity, and the chaos at the Cannabis Control Commission. We have a slew of guests here to hash it all out. Pardon the pun. First, though, the presidential race. We're less than 4 months to Election Day, and some Democrats are openly wondering whether President Biden is fit enough to be the party's nominee and serve another 4 years. His shaky and at times unfocused debate performance against former President Trump led many Democrats to question his mental fitness and his viability as a candidate. And some Democrats say the Biden campaign's slow response to those concerns about his mental fitness didn't reassure anyone. The New York Times reported that during a call with the White House chief of staff and Democratic governors, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey called President Biden's political position, quote, irretrievable. After several days of the campaign and White House doing damage control, the president finally himself reached out to Democratic members of Congress and governors and made it clear no one is pushing him out of the race. But several polls indicate the president is losing ground to the former president over the past week and a half. The morning after that fateful debate, Massachusetts State Senator Jason Lewis took to Twitter to say now is the time for Biden to step aside so a younger leader could take on Donald Trump, and calling for an open convention next month in August. Senator Jason Lewis joins us in studio this morning, along with Jeff Deal, the Republican who was President Trump's Bay State campaign chair back in 2020, and Democratic analyst Jaquetta Van Zant, host of the Politics and Prosecco podcast. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. Senator, we'll start with you, and I want to give you some credit. For the last week, we've heard from anonymous sources, people close to the president, people within the president's orbit. You put your name on the call for him to step aside. What makes you think that is the best path forward for Biden and his campaign?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me this morning. I think President Biden is a decent and honorable American. He has a distinguished record of public service. I think by most metrics, his presidency's been very successful. But to me, the debate was really the last straw. I've been thinking about this for many months, that he is not the best candidate we can put forward to beat Donald Trump in November. And so I think it's time for President Biden to gracefully step aside.
The White House would say, look at his record. Look at what he's done the past 3.5 years. We just got another jobs report that looked pretty good. Do you think the debate performance is going to outweigh all of that when those voters step into the booth?
All of that is true. And he's accomplished a tremendous amount, great legislative track record, done a lot for this country. But again, what we're talking about now is who's going to be the Democratic Party nominee going forward for the 2024 election. And I think it's pretty clear right now that the American people, including the majority of Democrats, have lost confidence in President Biden's ability to lead our party to victory in November. And I think our party is very fortunate that we have a number of other talented, experienced, younger candidates who could be ready to step up if we had an open convention and if President Biden were to step aside.
Jeff, what do you make of this situation? I'm not going to ask you what you think the Democrats should do, but as a supporter of former President Trump, do you think this is better for his campaign to have Biden stay in the race, or is there anyone perhaps who would fill in for the president that Republicans say, ooh, that makes things a little bit difficult for us?
Well, first of all, I think Donald Trump would welcome Biden staying in the race. I think he knows that's not going to be a reality. I think the senator is correct in his assessment, and actually I applaud you for taking a fairly brave step. It's not normal to make a tough call like that, which I know draws national attention. But at the same time, I do agree that the country right now needs strong leadership. And whether the Democrat Party decides that they're going to go to Kamala Harris, which I think would be the logical next step, or let other people audition for it, whether Trump has an issue with any of those, I don't know, because it's going to really be based on who he ends up selecting as to whether or not I think Trump has concerns. But at this point, even Kamala Harris is polling behind Donald Trump. So if things go the way I think they will go, which is giving the vice president her time now to run, I don't think he's concerned.
Jax, let's go ahead and bring you in. What is your head telling you the president is going to do? What does your heart want him to do?
My head is telling me that this is very dangerous. See, what I think the problem is, Republicans have a very good way of circling the wagons around their candidate, no matter how great or how bad they are. And this sets a very bad precedent for Democrats when they're saying, you know, just this one little incident is now why we should start panicking. If that's the case, then we need to ask Nancy Pelosi to step down. We needed to ask Ted Kennedy to step down when he was older. This is a very bad way of thinking about things. My heart is saying, we have to really focus on getting these apathetic voters to the polls, no matter what. And my head is telling me, if this is the way the party is going to go, every old white man over the age of 70, we need to call for their resignation, no matter how great they are, if that's the case.
Let's talk about former President Trump, because he was also on that debate stage. And while a lot of the focus has been on President Biden's performance, former President Donald Trump, by all accounts, did not have the best debate. He didn't answer a lot of the questions. When he did answer, he told a lot of lies and mistruths. And he, too, has shown some signs of slipping over the past few years. He confuses names sometimes. Sometimes his statements can be incoherent and rambling. And people at his criminal trial in New York said it appeared that he was falling asleep during the trial. Do you think the president or the former president isn't sort of getting called to the mat about his age and his mental fitness as much as President Biden is? Well,
I think there's actually a pretty robust debate about age overall, whether or not, I don't think term limits, for example, we know there is presidential term limits. He'd be going into his second term, and then we'd be done with it after that. So, I think people are taking age into consideration. But at the same time, I think he was a little more agile during that debate. So I think maybe that dispel some of the concerns. In general, though, I do think it is time for Republicans and Democrats to start looking towards the future. And vice presidential candidates, whether in this case, whether Biden gets replaced as the candidate by Kamala Harris and then somebody else is picked, or the Republicans pick for vice president, that's going to be important. And I think they should look to a younger generation so we don't have these concerns for the future.
Do you think come Election Day, let's say President Biden is still the nominee, do you think on Election Day a voter is going to step into that booth knowing what Donald Trump wants to do with the country and what President Biden wants to do with the country and say, okay, I agree with President Biden's view on policies, but he's too old. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Do you think that's a legitimate risk?
Well, look, I think Donald Trump is an immoral, dishonest, narcissistic human being. And I think that his policies that he's proposing now are even more dangerous and more extreme than what he tried to do when he was president last time. So I think there's an absolutely clear choice here between Donald Trump as a Republican nominee and whoever the Democratic nominee is. If the convention nominates Joe Biden, I will support him and Kamala Harris 100%. I will be behind them because so much is at stake in this election for our country and the world. But there's still time. The convention is not till later in August. There's still time. If the president were to step aside, again, we could nominate a different nominee, a different candidate to be our nominee, and I think we would be more successful in November up and down the ticket if we did that.
Jax, I'm no political strategist, so I'll ask you this question. I think when it comes to who would replace President Biden were he to step aside, I think Democrats legitimately have about three options: Vice President, Kamala Harris, and the former senator from California. Can it be anybody but Kamala Harris?
It shouldn't be, but I think, Gretchen is on that short list. Mm-hmm. I've heard Joe Kennedy. I've heard a few other people. There are many options. And if Jeff is right, if we should look to the future, there are many, many under the radar Democrats and Republicans who are doing God's work out here. And, there are other options that we have, but that shouldn't be our first choice. We need to stop running for the hills.
Would black voters in the Democratic Party forgive the party for bypassing the black vice president woman for any other white candidate?
I think they will. Listen, African-American voters aren't just focused on the color of whatever candidate it is. We're focused on, especially this race, the economy. So whoever's going to bring our economy up to a space where we're all having an equal level and that we are all working towards building out a sustainable future, I think that's the candidate that we'll be with.
Let's talk about this notion of an open convention from a Republican standpoint. Is that what you would want to see? Do you think that would benefit former President Trump's campaign the most, to see sort of what is always the cliche, Democrats in disarray come the convention?
No, I don't think an open convention benefits anybody. Our country is in need of some serious leadership now. I think both parties would like to know who the candidates are going forward, and then make the arguments, a differentiation between the presidential and the vice presidential candidates. Have those debates and give people the sense of security that they had as much time as possible to review the candidates and select the person that's going to lead us through these next 4 critical years. We are still, I think, as mentioned, going through a lot of major issues, whether it's immigration, the economy. There is a lot of things that we need to work on, and we need to be serious, and we need to work together down in D.C., not further apart. So the sooner both parties can get their act together, in this case the Democrats, I think the better.
Brokered convention, yes or no? And do you think it would help the party if it is brokered?
Oh, look, if President Biden were to announce tomorrow he's stepping aside, and Kamala Harris jumps in, and Governor Newsom of California, Governor Whitmer of Michigan, whoever else, Governor Shapiro, that would be so exciting. It would upstage the Republican convention, which is coming up in 2 weeks, because everybody would be focused on what's happening on the Democratic side.
Could also lead to some intra-party fighting, though, wouldn't it?
It could. It's messy. I'll acknowledge it's messy, and there's some risk. But I think we would have some terrific candidates. They would be traveling the country, energetically campaigning, doing lots of media experiences, talking to voters, making their case. Come the convention, I have confidence the delegates would be able to make that choice. We'd come out of the convention united with lots of excitement, enthusiasm, and momentum.
Jax, will give you the final word on a brokered convention. Yes or no?
Yes, I'm here for it.
All right. Short but sweet. Thank you so much, Senator Lewis, Jeff Deal, Jaquetta Van Zant. We appreciate you taking the time here on At Issue. President Biden weighed in on the bombshell decision by the Supreme Court that set a new standard for presidential immunity and effectively handed a political victory to former President Trump. The court's conservative majority in a 6-3 ruling said that former presidents have sweeping immunity for their official actions while in office. President Biden warned that it means there are virtually no limits on what a president can do.
The power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone.
More now on the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. Joining us from New York is NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Danny, the court ruled the president cannot be prosecuted for core constitutional powers like issuing a veto. They also said he's due a presumptive immunity for prosecution for all of his official acts, but not any unofficial acts. So it seems there's a lot that a president can do or order his subordinates to do, so long as it's an official act of the office of a president. So let's sort of game this out a little bit with the scenario involving an official act. The court found that the president is now immune from prosecution. So if a president, say, was offered a substantial amount of money or a campaign donation in exchange for a pardon, he would be immune?
This is exactly what Justice Sotomayor worried about in her dissent, and the answer appears to be yes. Even though the act of a bribery is a criminal act, that core presidential power, including the pardon, which, by the way, is one of the broadest core presidential powers, that in theory would be immune. But I mean, there are so many hypotheticals, many of which Justice Sotomayor herself came up with. These are all doomsday scenarios. But in theory, yes, this would be bribery and it would be immune, absolutely immune.
So at the foundation of this case, of course, is Team Trump's assertion that the former president was immune when his alleged activity took place. So let's talk about the trials he is facing for trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election, even the Georgia election interference case. What impact does the ruling have on those cases moving forward?
The ruling has the strongest impact, of course, on the D.C. January 6 trial before Judge Chutkan. That's because many of the allegations involve Trump's conduct while in office as president, and he's going to be able to raise a defense now that his conduct involved official conduct. Even if it wasn't core presidential functions, as long as it's official conduct, he has a presumption of immunity, and the government has to disprove the immunity. They have the burden. So Donald Trump very much in the lead. It doesn't start from zero. Donald Trump is ahead in the race as it heads down to the district court. The next case that it likely affects is the Georgia case because it shares many of the same allegations, similar allegations that Donald Trump did things while president that Georgia prosecutors contend is criminal conduct. So Georgia's the next most affected by this, then arguably the documents case in Florida. But a lot of that conduct happened after Trump left office. And perhaps the case least affected by this is the New York criminal trial, now a criminal verdict against Donald Trump, because those allegations are about him paying off a porn star, Stormy Daniels. And even though the reimbursement checks were signed after he was in office, most of this conduct occurred before he was president, and even the conduct that occurred after, it would be really hard to tie that to some official presidential duty, repaying someone who paid off a porn star for you.
I don't know if you've been on social media over the last few days, but they're replaying these clips of the confirmation hearings from Justice Alito, Justice Roberts, where they both said no one is above the law. But critics of the immunity ruling are saying they have done precisely that, put the president above the law. What do you make of the criticism of that ruling?
It's a fair criticism. I think reasonable minds can differ, but the principle that no one is above the law is a nice principle. It's just not something that applies equally and really never has. I mean, for example, there's long been something called executive privilege, which recognizes that the president, in some situations, is different than other people. He gets special treatment. So our system has long recognized that the president and other people in government get special treatment. For example, the speech or debate clause protects members of Congress for what they speak about on the floor of Congress, and that kind of is an immunity and treats them differently than other people. So while it's a really nice notion that no person is above the law, sometimes people are above the law, and that's the way it's been for centuries now. But yes, it is something to aspire to, that no person be above the law, especially the criminal law.
Well, it's certainly been a busy few weeks. Danny, we really appreciate you jumping on At Issue and taking the time to walk us through the sort of new reality that we are now living in with the decisions coming down from the Supreme Court. NBC News legal analyst Danny Stavalis. Danny, thanks for joining us. All right, coming up, could a major change be on the way for the Cannabis Control Commission? On Tuesday, Inspector General Jeffrey Shapiro will testify before state lawmakers about his call for a receiver to oversee the agency. Up next, Shapiro and State Senator Michael Moore join me in studio to talk about their concerns for the CCC. Welcome back to At Issue. You know, cannabis is a $7 billion business in Massachusetts, and it's brought in more than $1 billion in state and local tax revenue. But there's a lot of trouble at the Cannabis Control Commission, which oversees the retail and medical marijuana industry. The agency's chair, Shannon O'Brien, was suspended last September for allegedly making racist remarks and mistreating a staffer. Now, O'Brien denies the allegations and has sued in response. Several hearings aimed at determining O'Brien's fate have been held, but she remains suspended with pay. Also, the agency's executive director left the agency last December. And last month, the person who replaced him on an acting basis was removed from that position. So, a few weeks ago, the state's Inspector General, Jeffrey Shapiro, issued a report calling the CCC a, quote, rudderless agency without a clear indication of who's responsible for running its day-to-day operations. Joining us now is Inspector General Jeffrey Shapiro and State Senator Michael Moore, who represents parts of Worcester and Shrewsbury and has been calling for more oversight of the CCC. Inspector General, in your letter, you called the legislative leaders in Massachusetts to step in. You gave them some specific steps to address the leadership issues at the CCC. What do you believe is the solution here?
I think it's a two-part. First of all, thank you for having me, Corey. I think it's a two-part solution, which is why I issued my letter on the 18th of June. I think the first part is immediately the day-to-day operations need to be controlled, and there needs to be clarity as to who's running the operation. As you said, this is a $7 billion industry at this point, and it's a new business entity and a new stream of business that we need to be mindful of. So there needs to be day-to-day clarity, and I believe that to be a receiver. Second of all, I believe next legislative session, we'll have time to look at the overall governance structure. But I don't believe, with the time that's left in the formal sessions until the 31st of July, that we have enough time to do both things. And I think immediate action requires the appointment of a receiver.
So in your letter, which I read, you talk about the chair of the commission, the executive director, and the statutes that say what they're supposed to do. And I read both of them back to back, and it kind of seems they both have the same jobs. Is that some of the vagueness that is in the statute as it exists today?
So it absolutely is. And those are the things that in our review and ultimately in the letter that we issued, we pointed out. I think that this is certainly not about the people, it's about the structure. And I feel that the governance structure needs to be fixed. But in order to do that, that's going to take some time. There's a lot of different opinions as to what needs to happen. However, day to day, there's an industry, as I said, that is relying upon this. And there are nearly 100 employees that work in that agency, maybe a little bit more. They have at least 20 vacancies, and those people need to know who's in charge. And right now, some things are done by the acting executive director. Some are done by the commission as a whole. Some appear to be done by the acting chair. And if I'm an employee that works there, it's very unclear to me to whom I report, and with this lack of clarity, in my opinion, it's the dream of any sixth grader that doesn't like what's going on at home, and they ask another parent or another adult in their life.
Senator Moore, are you surprised that it's come to this at the CCC, everything going on with Shannon O'Brien, folks coming in and out?
Yes. Other than the Chelsea Soldier Home, my 15 years, I've never heard of a state entity a request to have the state entity put in receivership. So I am surprised that it's really deteriorated this far from where we were about a year ago, January. I think every aspect of the commission, we've got issues from operational control of it, the day-to-day, treatment of staff, treatment of retailers or the people who are investing in this industry. So I think we need an overhaul of the agency, the operations, and making sure that we are setting up a new industry here in Massachusetts for the future. As you pointed out, $6 to $7 billion industry, tax collections are great. If that's what you're looking at, that's fine. But you got to look at what's the potential. 10 years ago, we passed social equity. We did the social consumption for the cafes. So you could sit and say, okay, it's at the $6 to $7 billion, but should it be at $10 billion? Should it be here? And also now you look at some of the entities that are currently operating in Massachusetts. There's a lot of strain on them. We're looking at trying to put more investment into the social equity. But we're putting them into a climate now where we have retailers that have a hard time staying open because of and this is good for consumers, the prices have plummeted, but for the individuals who have made their own financial investments into these retail businesses, they're now under financial strain. And you got to remember, this is their money. Because this is not legal federally, they're not getting money from financial institutions. They're investing their own money and putting their own livelihoods at stake, or family financial livelihoods at stake.
So with the stakes so high, is there an appetite on Beacon Hill to do this?
I hope so. A year and a half ago, the session first started, I filed legislation to actually install a unit in the CCC, a unit from the Inspector General's office in the CCC to look at the operational structure of it, the day-to-day practices. We also requested an oversight hearing, myself and several other colleagues, into the operations, and we haven't seen much movement now on that. So I'm hoping now with the Inspector General coming out with his report, and then we've got other issues. The auditor, Diana DeZoglio, she commented I don't want to say a full audit, but in a report that they had issues with the testing of product. So I'm hoping we will. We've got less than a month and a half left. I'm hoping that this gains traction. I will be filing, as part of an economic development bill, an amendment to that to try to implement the recommendations that the Inspector General has recommended, and we'll see.
Well, it's certainly a situation that we're going to continue to monitor as things move forward and hopefully progress. We'll be watching to see what happens on Beacon Hill and with the commission itself. Inspector General Jeffrey Shapiro, State Senator Michael Moore, thank you so much for being on the show this Sunday. We appreciate it. That's it for this edition of At Issue. But join us next Sunday when Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll comes to the studio. We'll talk about the Healy-Driscoll administration's efforts to address the housing crisis, the steps taken to find shelter for migrants, and so much more. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday. Enjoy your day.